I remember the day I finally got the keys to my new house like it was a scene in a movie. The sun was shining, the air smelled like fresh-cut grass, and I could almost hear birds chirping in perfect harmony. I'd been dreaming of this moment for years, my own slice of paradise, a house with a yard big enough to host weekend barbecues, and most importantly, a place where I could actually relax without worrying about anyone else dictating what color my mailbox should be. As I turned onto my street, everything seemed almost too perfect. Manicured lawns stretched on either side, and every house looked like it had been plucked from a home decor magazine. But then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the driveway like a sentry, clipboard in hand, scanning every inch of the neighborhood as if it were her personal empire. Karen. I didn't know her name yet, but trust me, I would learn it fast. She looked exactly like you'd imagine a HOA president. Perfectly styled hair, a blazer crisp enough to slice bread, and an expression that could curdle milk. Before I could even park, she walked briskly toward me. "Hello, welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Karen, HOA president. I just wanted to introduce myself and go over some important rules you need to know." I smiled politely, already sensing that this would not be a casual chat. She launched into a speech that covered everything: mailbox colors, fence heights, paint shades for the siding, and even which types of flowers were allowed in front yards. I nodded along, pretending to take it all seriously while mentally planning which of her rules I could quietly ignore. Finally, she paused and gave me a triumphant look, as if she had successfully intimidated the new homeowner. And then I said it, calmly, innocently, almost as if it were nothing. "I don't follow your rules." I swear I saw the exact moment her entire worldview cracked. Her eyes widened, and for a brief second, I could see her trying to calculate how to respond without looking like she had lost control. She blinked, then attempted a tight-lipped smile. "Well, Don't worry," I interrupted, still smiling. "I'm aware of the HOA rules. I just choose not to follow them." Her jaw dropped slightly. She looked ready to call security, the cops, or possibly the National Guard. Instead, she spun on her heels and muttered something about authorities while storming off to her little HOA fortress down the street. I shook my head, amused. The sheer audacity of calling the cops on someone for owning their own house struck me as absurd. I mean, this was just a mailbox, and a fence, and a paint color. But it wasn't about the mailbox. It was about control. And I wasn't here to hand over my life to someone with a clipboard and a superiority complex. As I started unpacking, I couldn't help but replay the moment in my head. Karen, flustered and red-faced, probably plotting her next move. My mind wandered to all the stories I had heard about overzealous HOA presidents, but nothing could have prepared me for the personal attention I was about to receive. I sipped my coffee, leaning against a box, and chuckled to myself. Somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully, or at least as uneventful as it could, while knowing that Karen was probably making frantic calls and taking notes like a general preparing for battle. I walked around my yard, imagining all the illegal things I could do and smiling at the thought of pushing back, carefully, without breaking any real laws. Little did I know, the universe was about to make things even more interesting. Within an hour, I'd get a surprise that would set the tone for every encounter I'd have with Karen from that day forward. And it all started with a knock at my door. 2 police officers. Calm, professional but cautious. Karen had called them. My heart didn't race, instead I felt a quiet amusement. I opened the door with a smile and said, "Hi there, can I help you?" The officers glanced at each other, then at me, trying to figure out what to do next. I could see it in their eyes, this wasn't a typical complaint. And in the distance, I could just make out Karen packing like a caged tiger, muttering about rules and enforcement. I leaned against the doorframe and sipped my coffee again. Honestly, I was starting to enjoy this. And that's when I realized something crucial. In this battle of wills, I might be the quietest storm Karen had ever faced. And she had no idea. I was still unpacking boxes when I heard the telltale crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I peeked out the window and froze for a split second. Two police officers were walking toward my front door, their expressions polite but cautious. Of course, Karen had called them. My first thought, only in America could someone call the cops because of a mailbox. My second thought, this was going to be fun. I opened the door, holding my coffee like I was offering a peace treaty. "Hi, officers. How can I help you today?" I asked, smiling. They gave me a polite nod, their hands resting casually on their belts. One of them cleared his throat. "We received a complaint from the HOA regarding your property." I nodded sagely, as if this were the most natural conversation in the world. "Yes, I'm aware. I know about the HOA rules. I just choose not to follow them." The officers exchanged a glance. I could almost hear the unsaid thought, really, this is happening because of a mailbox. Before they could respond, Karen appeared, storming up the driveway like a hurricane in heels. "I demand you issue fines immediately," she barked, pointing her finger at me like a judge delivering a sentence. Her face was red, her eyes wild, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. I leaned casually against the doorframe, sipping my coffee, and said, "Of course, whatever you think is necessary." My tone was calm, almost teasing, and I could see her confidence start to wobble. One of the officers cleared his throat again. "Ma'am, sir, we're here to assess the situation, not to enforce HOA rules. That's a civil matter." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "But they are homeowners," the officer said patiently, "and they're allowed to manage their property as they see fit, within the law. HOA rules don't have police enforcement." I couldn't help but grin. Karen froze, her jaw tightening as if someone had just slammed a door on her authority. I could almost hear the mental gears grinding inside her head. She had always ruled this neighborhood like a queen, never expecting to meet someone who wouldn't bow. And now here I was, calm as ever, sipping coffee while her world tilted on its axis. I decided to turn the tension into a teaching moment for her and secretly for the officers. "Look," I said, "I understand HOA rules. I know what they want, but I bought this house for me, not for their checklist. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm not harassing anyone. I'm simply living my life. And I'm very polite about it." The officers nodded, scribbling something on their clipboards, clearly relieved to be out of the middle of a petty war. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she was about to combust. Her eyes darted between me and the officers, silently pleading for validation, for authority, for something. Then came the moment that made the whole encounter unforgettable. Karen leaned toward the officers, whispering fiercely, "They're breaking the rules. You have to do something." The taller officer, holding back a smirk, glanced at me. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "these aren't laws. We can't enforce HOA rules. You'll have to take this up with the HOA board in civil court if you want action." Her face went pale. She blinked once, then twice, and I swear I saw the color drain out of her cheeks like water running down a drain. I almost wanted to reach out and pat her shoulder. Almost. As the officers left, Karen muttered something about "this isn't over" before storming back toward her HOA fortress. I leaned against the doorframe and laughed quietly. The absurdity of it all, the rage, the paperwork, the wasted time, was almost cinematic. I sipped my coffee again, thinking, she has no idea what she's up against. I realized in that moment that the battle lines were drawn. Karen had her rules, her sense of absolute control, and I had my house, my ownership, and my calm patience. But the real weapon? Knowledge. I knew things about her world she didn't expect, things that would come in handy later. And just like that, a quiet thrill ran down my spine. This was more than a disagreement about a mailbox. This was the beginning of a game I intended to win. I turned back inside, unpacked a few more boxes, and smiled. Karen might have called the cops, but I wasn't scared. I was entertained and ready. The next morning, I woke up to the faint sound of my neighbor's sprinklers and the distant hum of. I thought about the previous day, sipping my coffee and trying not to laugh. Karen. The name alone carried a certain dramatic flair. I could almost see her packing in her perfectly organized home office, muttering about rules, fines, and authority. She had no idea she had just stepped into a world she didn't understand. I checked my inbox and found it had already begun. Emails, letters, and notices from the HOA, each one more absurd than the last. One demanded I repaint my mailbox because the color was technically off by half a shade. Another fined me for non-compliant landscaping, even though the flowers were legally allowed. I read each message, smirked, and saved them all. Documentation is power, after all. I started thinking about Karen in a new way. She wasn't just overzealous, she was predictable. Every action she took screamed insecurity. I realized something crucial. In her mind, rules were a weapon, a way to assert dominance over others. But she had no idea that I wasn't just another homeowner to intimidate. I had leverage. A little secret, quietly tucked away, waiting for the perfect moment. You see, I happened to be in charge of a company that employed her daughter. It was a fact I had never shared, and until now, she had no clue. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen was trying to assert control over someone who literally had the power to affect her personal world in ways she couldn't even imagine. It was almost poetic. I spent the morning walking around my yard, inspecting my property, thinking through every infraction she might find. I imagined her reaction if I gently reminded her of her daughter's employment status at my company. The possibilities made me grin. There was power in patience, in subtlety, in letting her believe she was in charge while quietly knowing she was. By mid-afternoon, Karen had taken her next step, posting warning signs on the neighborhood bulletin board and circulating memos that I was a troublesome new resident. I could almost hear the exaggerated gasps and whispers she was counting on. But here's the thing, I was completely calm. Each message she sent, each attempt to provoke me, only reinforced my strategy. I started documenting everything in a folder labeled HOA Interactions. I made notes about dates, times, exact wording, and tone. Every email, every warning, every laughable fine was filed away. I wasn't just preparing for a possible confrontation, I was preparing to play the long game. Knowledge was power, and I had plenty of it. By late afternoon, I decided it was time for a small experiment. I wanted to see just how far Karen would go. I pulled out my mailbox paint swatches and chose the shade that technically with HOA rules, but added a small, almost imperceptible streak of bright color. It was the perfect blend of compliance and rebellion. I painted the mailbox with deliberate care, imagining her reaction. I knew she would come running, clipboard in hand, eyes wide, ready to lecture. But this time, I had the advantage. I was confident, calm, and fully prepared for her overreaction. The stage was set. As the sun began to set, I poured myself another cup of coffee and watched from the window. Across the street, I saw Karen packing, muttering to herself, clearly noticing the mailbox. She squinted, leaned closer, and then flapped her hands in frustration. I couldn't hear her words, but the body language said it all: anger, confusion, and disbelief. I chuckled quietly. This was just the beginning. Karen thought she had the upper hand, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I had patience, strategy, and an understanding of the law. And most importantly, I had leverage she didn't even know existed. That evening, as I closed my laptop and sipped my coffee one last time, I realized something thrilling. The HOA thought they were in control. But in reality, the balance of power had already shifted, quietly, subtly, and completely. Karen was about to learn, the hard way, that rules don't always mean authority, and control isn't always what it seems. I leaned back, smiling. Tomorrow, the real fun would begin. The next morning, I woke to an eerily quiet street. Normally, the hum of or the distant chatter of neighbors would greet me, but today it felt like the calm before a storm. I knew exactly what was coming. Karen's obsession with control was about to hit a new level, and I was ready for it. Sure enough, by mid-morning, the first email arrived. Karen had noticed my mailbox, the one I had painted the previous day, perfectly compliant by the letter but absurdly creative by spirit. Her words were precise, sharp, and dripping with frustration. Your mailbox violates Section 324 of the HOA guidelines. Immediate corrective action is required. I smiled, leaned back in my chair, and took a sip of coffee. I knew exactly how to respond. I drafted a polite email. Thank you for your note. As per Section 324, my mailbox color technically complies. Please advise if there are additional specifications I should follow. I hit send and leaned back, knowing full well that she would read it, fume silently, and feel powerless to do anything about it. By noon, Karen had escalated. Notices appeared on my lawn, attached with little stakes and bright red letters warning of noncompliance. I walked outside, pretending to read them carefully, then picked one up and held it over my shoulder like a theatrical prop. The neighbors passing by were probably trying not to laugh. I could hear whispers of curiosity and amusement. Karen, in her mind, was orchestrating fear, but in reality, she was making herself a spectacle. I started to notice other neighbors glancing at me, some with sympathy, others with hidden smiles. Slowly, I realized that Karen's obsession wasn't just about me, it was about control, and she was losing it in plain sight. It was almost poetic to watch. That evening, I decided to push things a little further, but legally. I selected the color swatch from my paint set, one that technically matched the HOA's approved shades, but added a few extra stripes in bold, clashing colors. My mailbox would comply, technically, but Karen would be unable to resist pointing out the absurdity. It was a delicate balance, like walking a tightrope with a coffee cup in hand. I painted it carefully, humming to myself. I imagined Karen walking down the street, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowing, lips pressed tight. I could almost hear her muttering, "This is impossible. Who does this?" The next morning she arrived, exactly as I had predicted. She stopped in front of my house, arms crossed, squinting at the mailbox as if she could melt the paint with sheer willpower. I waved casually, coffee in hand, and smiled. The audacity of being calm while someone else fumed, it never got old. "Do you see this?" she snapped, pointing at the stripes. "This is completely unacceptable." I tilted my head, innocently. "Actually, it's completely acceptable," I said. "It meets all the specifications outlined in Section 324, but I'm happy to discuss any other concerns you might have." She opened her mouth, then closed it, then muttered something about rules and walked away. I knew she was fuming, and I knew she had no recourse. The more she tried to control, the more absurd and powerless she looked. By afternoon, whispers spread through the neighborhood. A few neighbors approached me cautiously, asking what I had done. I shrugged, smiling, and said, "I just followed the rules." But the truth was, it wasn't just about following rules, it was about bending them in a way that exposed her obsession and overreach. I spent the rest of the day enjoying the quiet satisfaction of seeing Karen scramble. Every little step she took, every over-the-top reaction, was feeding my plan. And the best part, she still had no idea that the balance of power wasn't just about the mailbox. It was about the leverage I held, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I looked out the window at my yard, my mailbox standing proud, stripes and all. Karen might have thought she was the one in control, but I knew better. And I couldn't wait for the next chapter in this little game of patience, rules, and quiet victories. One thing was certain. She would keep coming at me, and I would keep responding, not with anger, but with calm, strategic persistence. And every overreaction, every furious email, every absurd complaint only made the story more entertaining. The real fun was just beginning. It was the morning of the HOA board meeting, and I could feel the tension in the air before I even arrived. The sky was overcast, perfect for a dramatic showdown, and every step toward the community center felt like walking into a battlefield. I carried myself with calm confidence, sipping my coffee as I passed neatly trimmed hedges and curious neighbors who gave me cautious glances. Karen was already there, standing at the front of the room like a general ready to address her troops. Clipboard in hand, she scanned the audience of board members and homeowners with the kind of intensity that could make glass crack. I could see the smug little smile she had plastered on her face. It was the "I'm in control" smile. How little she knew. As I walked in and took a seat near the front, the room went quiet. I could feel every eye on me, some curious, some apprehensive, and a few trying to hide stifled laughter. Karen wasted no time launching into her prepared speech, listing off my violations in rapid-fire succession: mailbox color, fence height, landscaping choices, and I swear, a complaint about the angle of the sunlight hitting my house. I sat quietly, listening, occasionally nodding, smiling politely, and sipping my coffee. Her indignation was almost cinematic, and I couldn't help but notice how ridiculous she looked packing back and forth, gesturing wildly at my mailbox like it had personally insulted her. Finally, she turned to me, eyes narrowing. "You need to understand, these rules exist for a reason. Compliance is not optional." I leaned back in my chair, adopting an air of casual ease. "I completely understand," I said. "I'm aware of the rules and I respect the neighborhood standards. I'm just choosing to interpret them in my own way." She blinked, caught off guard by my calm response. Normally, homeowners cowered, apologized, or tried to negotiate. But I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled politely, as if we were discussing paint colors at a dinner party rather than rules she held sacred. The room shifted. I could see the other board members exchanging glances, some trying not to smirk, others clearly uncomfortable with her theatrics. And that's when I decided it was time for a subtle drop of information, a whisper of leverage that would change everything. "Oh, by the way," I said casually, letting the words hang in the air like a cloud of smoke, "I'm actually familiar with the company that your daughter works for. I oversee operations there." Karen froze mid-sentence, her hand clutching the clipboard as if it were a life raft. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I could almost hear the mental gears grinding, trying desperately to regain control, to figure out how this changed the game. The room was silent, and for a brief, glorious moment I felt the shift in energy. She wasn't the queen of this neighborhood anymore. I wasn't just another homeowner, suddenly I had authority she couldn't dismiss. The board members were polite, but their expressions betrayed amusement, relief, and disbelief. Even some of the neighbors who had been quietly observing leaned forward in intrigue. Karen tried to regain composure. She cleared her throat, attempted a firm tone, but it was weak, faltering, like a candle struggling against the wind. Every gesture she made screamed panic beneath the veneer of control. I let her squirm for a few seconds longer before continuing, softly, but pointedly. "I'm happy to discuss anything with you directly, Karen, but I'm also happy to ensure that all HOA interactions remain professional and civil. I know the rules, and I intend to follow them to the letter where required." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked around the room as if seeking reinforcements. But everyone was looking at her differently now. No one was stepping in to support her exaggerated claims. She was isolated, flustered, and most importantly, powerless. As the meeting continued, I could see her trying to recover, throwing in half-hearted arguments and citing rules nobody cared to enforce. Meanwhile, I sipped my coffee, calmly observing the chaos of her unraveling authority. This was more than a confrontation about paint and mailboxes, it was a psychological victory. I could feel the tension in the room melt, replaced by a subtle admiration, or maybe fear, of the fact that I had stayed composed while Karen crumbled. By the time the meeting ended, Karen slunk out with the faintest trace of dignity, clearly plotting her next move but aware now that she wasn't in control. I walked out, smiling to myself. The first major confrontation was over, and I had won without raising my voice, without anger, and without breaking a single law. As I stepped into the sunlight, I realized something exciting. This neighborhood thought it knew who ruled, but the real game had only just begun. And I was holding all the cards. The morning after the board meeting, I woke up with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Karen had tried to assert control, had thrown her usual tantrums, and yet here I was calm, sipping my coffee, fully aware that the balance of power had subtly shifted. The previous day's confrontation had gone exactly as I had hoped. But the real thrill, the part that would truly shake her to her core, was still to come. By mid-morning, the HOA emails and notices had piled up again. Karen was relentless, each one dripping with thinly veiled frustration. I opened the first email and smiled. It was a warning about the incorrect angle of my fence in relation to my neighbor's property line. I read it, chuckled quietly, and saved it in my growing folder of Karen's overreach. I spent the next hour reviewing her correspondence, thinking about how predictable she was. Each email, each threat, each furious demand followed a pattern. She was obsessed with rules, with authority, with control, but she had no idea how powerless she actually was in the bigger picture. That's when I realized it was time. It was time to make her understand the true extent of her miscalculation. I calmly drafted a short message, careful to keep my tone polite but firm. Karen, I'm happy to discuss your concerns about compliance. I do want to remind you that your daughter works under my supervision at her company. I'm confident we can handle any issues professionally. I didn't hit send immediately. I waited, I watched, I let anticipation build, because I knew what would happen the moment she read those words. A few minutes later, the reply came, or rather, the first sign of it. Karen paused at her computer, eyes widening, mouth opening, closing, and then opening again. I could almost see the mental gears spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, trying to process the information that completely upended her perception of authority. By mid-afternoon, word of the revelation had spread across the HOA board. Board members were whispering, some trying to hide smirks, others exchanging knowing glances. Karen, once the unshakable queen of neighborhood rules, was visibly flustered. She attempted to regain control, but her gestures were jerky, her voice faltering. Every sentence she tried to deliver was undercut by the realization that she had just been confronted by someone who could affect her personal life in ways she hadn't imagined. I leaned back in my chair, sipping coffee as if this were just another morning. The beauty of the moment was in its subtlety. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't thrown tantrums, and I hadn't made threats. I had simply revealed a fact, calmly, politely, and strategically, that completely shifted the playing field. Karen's face twisted between anger and disbelief. I could see her trying to compose herself, scanning the room for support, but there was none. Even her most loyal board allies were hesitant, unsure how to respond to a revelation that none of them had anticipated. A neighbor whispered quietly as she walked past my house later that afternoon. "Wow, did you see Karen? She looked like she'd just seen a ghost." I smiled quietly to myself. Ghost or not, this was the beginning of the end of her illusion of control. By evening, Karen had retreated to her home, plotting, stewing, trying to figure out her next move. Meanwhile, I organized my notes, sipping my coffee with a sense of calm triumph. I knew she would keep coming at me, but each interaction now had a new dynamic. I was no longer just a rebellious homeowner. I was someone with authority she couldn't ignore, someone whose patience and strategy would shape every encounter moving forward. I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the neatly trimmed lawns, and reflected on the situation. Karen had believed she was untouchable, that her rules were absolute, that her power was unquestionable. But the truth was, she had underestimated me. She had misjudged patience, strategy, and subtle leverage. And soon, she would understand that true authority isn't about shouting, enforcing, or threatening. It's about calm confidence, awareness of the rules, and knowing when to reveal the unexpected. I took another sip of coffee, smiling at the thought. The battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Karen's world, built on control and intimidation, was beginning to crumble, not because I wanted to humiliate her, but because I refused to bend to unnecessary authority. And in that moment, I realized something thrilling. The next time she tried to assert dominance, it wouldn't just be another complaint or email. It would be her slowly learning that I wasn't just a homeowner. I was someone who held the cards, and she had no idea how to play against me. The real reveal had happened, and Karen would never forget it. Karen wasn't done. I knew that the moment she realized I had leverage over her world. She had always been relentless, and even after the revelation about her daughter, she still believed she could somehow wrest control back. I could practically feel her plotting from a mile away. It started with another email, this one more aggressive than ever. "Immediate compliance is required or legal action will be pursued," she wrote, her words dripping with desperation and authority. She was reaching for the nuclear option, a lawsuit. I read it, leaned back in my chair, and let out a quiet laugh. She had no idea the terrain she was stepping onto. Later that afternoon, she appeared at my door in person, clutching her clipboard like a weapon. "This is your final warning," she snapped. "You need to comply with the HOA rules or I will take legal action. You have no idea what's coming." I smiled calmly, taking a deliberate sip of coffee. "Karen," I said gently, "I understand your concerns. I know the rules. I'm happy to follow them where the law requires, but your threats of legal action are unnecessary." I let a pause hang in the air, just long enough for her to sense that I wasn't intimidated. She leaned closer, her eyes flashing with frustration, but before she could speak, I delivered the subtle twist. "You know," I said casually, "your daughter's employment under my supervision means any escalation could reflect directly on the company. I'm confident we can resolve this professionally, without involving the courts." Her face went pale. The words hit her like a thunderbolt. I could see her mind racing, trying to calculate the consequences she hadn't anticipated. Every ounce of confidence she had carefully curated over the years crumbled in an instant. The neighborhood seemed to sense the shift too. A few neighbors had gathered quietly on their lawns, peeking through windows, curious about the confrontation. I noticed subtle smirks, suppressed giggles, and even a neighbor whispering to another, "She doesn't know what she's doing." Karen tried to recover, flailing verbally. "This doesn't change anything. I am the HOA president. You still have to." I held up a hand politely. "Karen, I respect the HOA, but I also have responsibilities that are outside the scope of your authority. You can issue fines, send letters, even post notices, but legally and professionally, there's only so much you can do." Her jaw tightened, and she opened her mouth, clearly searching for a comeback that wouldn't make her look foolish. But there wasn't one. Every argument she tried to make was already countered by calm logic and subtle leverage. Her usual weapons, intimidation, rules, threats, were useless. I could see it happening. The slow realization, the internal panic, the silent acknowledgement that she had lost this battle. And yet, she continued, flailing, desperately trying to salvage the last scraps of authority she thought she still held. I decided to let her struggle a little longer, sipping my coffee with exaggerated patience. The tension in the air was delicious. Every word she spat, every dramatic gesture, made her look weaker, more absurd, and more out of control. Finally, she stormed off, muttering threats about legal action that she would never follow through on. I watched her go, nodding the slight tremor in her stride, the way her shoulders slumped just enough to betray defeat. The neighbors' whispers grew louder, more amused, and I could feel the shift in the neighborhood's perception. Karen wasn't untouchable anymore. She was a cautionary tale. As I closed the door behind me, I reflected on the entire encounter. It wasn't just about mailboxes, fences, or paint colors anymore. It was about control, patience, and strategy. Karen had underestimated me at every turn, and her last attempt to regain power had only cemented my position. I poured myself another cup of coffee, savoring the calm after the storm. The final showdown had not yet officially ended, but one thing was clear. Karen's reign of terror was over. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and I had played my hand perfectly. The real victory wasn't in defeating her. It was in doing it quietly, confidently, and strategically, without ever losing my cool. I leaned back on my porch, letting the cool evening air wash over me, and smiled. The next day, the neighborhood would wake to the reality. I wasn't just a homeowner who ignored the rules. I was someone who knew how to play the game and win. And Karen, for all her bluster, had no idea how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered. The morning after Karen's last desperate attempt, I woke up to a strange kind of peace. The sun was warm, the birds were singing, and for once I didn't hear the frantic clip-clop of her heels packing across the neighborhood. It was quiet, almost eerily so, as if the street itself was taking a breath. I sipped my coffee slowly, enjoying the calm before the world caught up to reality. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood. By mid-morning, a few neighbors had stopped by, cautiously at first, to comment on the unfolding drama. "Did you see Karen yesterday?" one whispered, a faint smile tugging at their lips. "She looked stunned." Another nodded, eyes wide. "I think she finally realized she's not in charge here." I smiled politely, letting them think what they wanted. The quiet satisfaction of victory was mine to savor. The HOA board meeting scheduled for later that week became almost anticlimactic. Karen had tried to rally support, but her influence had waned. I arrived with the same calm demeanor as always, coffee in hand, and took my seat. The other board members avoided eye contact with her, politely acknowledging me instead. It was subtle, but the shift in power was unmistakable. Karen began her presentation, attempting to assert authority one last time, but her words carried no weight. I listened politely, nodding occasionally, until the moment was right. "I appreciate your concerns, Karen," I said quietly but firmly, "and I hope we can work together professionally. But as you know, my position within your daughter's company means that escalation isn't necessary. We can handle any issues calmly and legally without conflict." Her eyes widened again, the same mix of anger and disbelief I had seen before. She opened her mouth, clearly searching for something to say, but nothing came. The board members exchanged knowing glances. Even the neighbors present couldn't hide their amusement. The meeting concluded quickly after that. Karen tried to issue a few final threats, but they fell flat. I followed the polite procedure, documenting everything and keeping a calm demeanor. By the time the meeting ended, she slunk out of the room, shoulders slumped, clipboard forgotten on the table. She had no authority left, at least not over me. Later that evening, as I walked through my yard, I noticed the subtle changes in the neighborhood. People nodded politely as I passed. Some even smiled, quietly acknowledging that I had stood my ground. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a shift in the social balance. Karen's reign of petty control had ended, replaced by calm, quiet order. I took a moment to reflect on what had happened. The situation had started over something trivial, a mailbox, a fence, the color of paint. But it had evolved into a game of strategy, patience, and awareness. Karen had underestimated me at every turn, believing that shouting, threatening, and manipulating would ensure compliance. What she hadn't counted on was calm confidence, quiet leverage, and the subtle art of waiting for the perfect moment. I sipped my coffee, thinking about the lessons I had learned. Power isn't always about control or authority. Sometimes it's about patience, strategy, and knowing how to respond rather than react. Karen had been a master of intimidation, but even the most powerful rules crumble when faced with awareness, calmness, and subtle leverage. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm. Karen still existed, still tried to enforce trivial rules, but her influence had waned. People laughed quietly at her overzealous tendencies, but there was no fear left. I walked through the streets with confidence, finally able to enjoy my home the way I had imagined, peacefully, comfortably, and on my own terms. And as I sat on my porch that evening, sipping the last of my coffee and watching the sun set behind the trees, I realized something important. Life is full of small battles, petty conflicts, and people who try to assert control for no good reason. But it's not the loudest voices or the strictest rules that win. It's calm confidence, patience, and a little strategic thinking. Karen had taught me that lesson without realizing it. She had assumed power, tried to control, and in the end, I had prevailed, not by fighting fire with fire, but by understanding the true nature of authority and using it wisely. I smiled, leaning back in my chair, feeling the weight of victory settle comfortably around me. The HOA had tried to dictate my life, but I had remained true to myself, calm, strategic, and confident. And now the neighborhood knew the truth. Control isn't about rules or intimidation. It's about understanding, patience, and the quiet strength to hold your ground. The mailbox still had its stripes. The fence was perfectly legal. And for the first time since moving in, I felt like this house, this yard, and this neighborhood truly belonged to me. And Karen, she would always remember the day she realized she wasn't the one in charge. Victory, after all, is when it's quiet, strategic, and completely unexpected. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.